The phrase World War III has entered the discourse around the current transatlantic crisis, not because anyone believes a shooting war between NATO allies is imminent, but because the architecture of global order that emerged from the last World War is visibly fracturing. The institutions built to prevent great power conflict are being weaponized against the nations they were designed to protect. The alliances constructed to contain adversaries are now being used to coerce allies. And the question confronting European leaders is no longer whether they can preserve the post-war order, but whether they should seek alternative arrangements with powers that were supposed to be contained by it. China has not offered to help Europe against Trump. Beijing has not proposed a military alliance or a mutual defense pact. What China has done is far more subtle and potentially more significant. It has positioned itself as the defender of exactly the international norms that America is abandoning. It has maintained economic relationships that America is severing, and it has waited, with characteristic patience, for the contradictions in American policy to drive European capitals toward reconsideration. The mathematics of the current moment are stark. The European Union maintains approximately 945 billion euros in annual trade with the United States. It maintains approximately 740 billion euros in annual trade with China. These figures are close enough that a fundamental reorientation of European trade relationships is at least theoretically possible. What was once unthinkable is now being discussed in Brussels, Berlin, and Paris, not as a desired outcome, but as a contingency that must be planned for. Trump's national security strategy, released in November 2025, made the administration's view of Europe explicit. The document criticized European economic performance, European defense spending, and European democracy itself. It described the European Union as a regulatory obstacle to American commercial interests. It demanded that Brussels dismantle digital regulations that protect European citizens from American technology companies. And it signaled that the United States would actively support political forces within Europe that align with Washington's preferences, even if those forces are hostile to European integration. The strategy was welcomed in Moscow. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov called it largely consistent with Russia's view of the world. Beijing issued no such endorsement, but Chinese strategists studying the document reached a similar conclusion. The United States was no longer committed to the alliance system that had contained Chinese influence for 70 years. It was actively working to undermine it. The Greenland crisis brought this strategic shift into operational reality. Trump announced tariffs on 8 NATO allies not because of any trade dispute, but because those allies participated in a military exercise defending Danish territory. He threatened military force against a fellow NATO member. He dismissed the alliance's foundational principle, that an attack on one is an attack on all, as irrelevant to his territorial ambitions. European leaders responded with unprecedented unity. 8 countries issued a joint statement warning of a dangerous downward spiral. EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas observed that China and Russia must be having a field day as they benefit from divisions among allies. The European Parliament suspended debate on the trade agreement negotiated with Washington last year. France requested activation of the anti-coercion instrument, a trade weapon designed originally for use against China, now being considered for deployment against the United States. But unity in rhetoric does not translate automatically to unity in strategy. The question facing European capitals is what to do when deterrence fails, when accommodation produces only further demands, when the traditional protector becomes the threat. And it is in this question that China sees opportunity. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Guo Jiakun offered Beijing's perspective following the Greenland tariff announcement. International law based on the purposes and principles of the UN Charter is the foundation of the current international order and must be safeguarded, he said. We urge the U.S. side to stop using the so-called China threat as a pretext to pursue selfish gains. The statement defended international law while America violated it. It positioned China as the responsible power while Washington acted recklessly. It invited comparison. The structural dynamics pushing Europe toward engagement with China are not difficult to identify. Europe faces economic pressure from American tariffs. It faces security pressure from American threats. It faces political pressure from American interference in European domestic affairs. Simultaneously, Europe faces economic opportunity in Chinese markets, particularly as American tariffs redirect Chinese exports that once flowed to the United States. The incentives are aligning in ways they have not aligned before. Analysts at the Center for Strategic and International Studies have observed that China especially will see an opportunity to break up the transatlantic alliance and pull Europe closer. The German Marshall Fund has noted that Europe's relationship with China may fundamentally change if the transatlantic alliance continues to deteriorate. The Rhodium Group has identified scenarios in which a fundamental breakdown of transatlantic relations leads to a more conciliatory EU approach to Beijing. The evidence of nascent cooperation is already visible. Spain's Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez met with Chinese President Xi Jinping in Beijing, calling for a more balanced relationship. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen spoke by phone with Chinese Premier Li Qiang. The EU and China have discussed setting minimum prices for Chinese electric vehicles in place of punitive tariffs. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi toured European capitals, advocating for closer ties and deeper cooperation. Canada, America's closest neighbor and traditional ally, announced a strategic partnership with China that includes easing tariffs and selling Chinese electric vehicles. If Ottawa can recalibrate its relationship with Beijing in response to American pressure, European capitals may conclude they can do the same. But the obstacles to meaningful EU-China alignment remain formidable. These obstacles are structural, not merely political, and they will not disappear simply because Washington behaves badly. The first obstacle is economic competition. China's export-driven economic model directly threatens European manufacturing. Chinese overcapacity in electric vehicles, batteries, steel, and aluminum floods European markets with goods priced below production cost. European industry cannot compete. The German economy alone has lost 10,000 manufacturing jobs per month amid intensifying competition with Chinese exports. A closer relationship with Beijing would accelerate this destruction, not prevent it. The second obstacle is China's support for Russia. Beijing has enabled Moscow's war machine through the provision of dual-use technology, the purchase of Russian energy exports, and diplomatic cover at the United Nations. For European capitals that view Russia as an existential threat, Chinese complicity in Russian aggression creates an insurmountable barrier to genuine partnership. You cannot ally with the patron of your adversary. The third obstacle is values. European parliaments remain deeply concerned about human rights conditions in China, from Xinjiang to Hong Kong to Tibet. These concerns constrain what European governments can accept politically, regardless of what might be optimal strategically. Public opinion in most European countries views China unfavorably. Closer alignment would face domestic resistance that elected leaders cannot ignore. The fourth obstacle is the structural position of the European Union itself. The EU is a regulatory power, not a geopolitical actor in the traditional sense. Its influence derives from market access and standard setting, not military capability or strategic coherence. When Chinese officials tell European visitors that they have little interest in dealing with the Commission anymore and will focus their energy on EU member states, they are exploiting the structural weakness. A divided Europe cannot bargain effectively with any external power. What China offers, therefore, is not an alliance. It is an alternative. Not partnership, but optionality. Not protection, but positioning. Beijing does not need Europe to align against Washington. It needs Europe to hedge. It needs European capitals to maintain relationships with China that provide leverage against American pressure. It needs the mere possibility of European realignment to constrain American action. This is the subtle game that Chinese strategists excel at playing. They do not seek dramatic victories. They seek incremental advantages. They do not demand exclusive relationships. They cultivate dependencies. They do not threaten. They wait. The concept that best describes this dynamic is not alliance, but arbitrage. Europe can play the United States and China off against each other to maximize benefits, as one analyst observed of Greenland's position between the two powers. The same logic applies at continental scale. Europe cannot defeat America in a trade war. It cannot match China in manufacturing capacity, but it can position itself between them, extracting concessions from both by maintaining relationships with each. This is not World War III in any conventional sense. No armies are massing, no missiles are flying. The conflict is economic, not kinetic. The weapons are tariffs and sanctions and regulatory barriers, not bombs and bullets. But the stakes are comparable to those of previous great power conflicts. The outcome will determine which powers dominate the global economy, which currencies serve as reserves, which rules govern international commerce, which values shape international institutions. The parallel to the 1930s, often invoked carelessly, has some validity in this context. Then, as now, the international order constructed by the previous great power conflict was visibly failing. Then, as now, authoritarian powers were testing the resolve of democracies. Then, as now, traditional alliances were fraying under the pressure of economic competition and ideological divergence. The difference is that in the 1930s, the authoritarian challenge came from the margins of the global economy. Today, it comes from its center. China is not Nazi Germany. The comparison is historically illiterate and strategically misleading. But China is a revisionist power seeking to reshape international institutions to better serve its interests. It is a rising power challenging the dominance of the incumbent hegemon, and it is an authoritarian power offering an alternative model of governance to democracies in crisis. These realities must inform European calculations, even as Europe grapples with an American administration that treats allies worse than adversaries. The Defense Readiness Roadmap 2030, agreed by European Union leaders in October 2025, represents one response to this dilemma. The plan initiates major investment in European defense capabilities, with full implementation beginning in 2026. The Eastern Flank Watch will establish integrated air defense, ground defense, and maritime security across the Baltic and Black Sea regions. The European Drone Defense Initiative will address the hybrid warfare tactics Russia has deployed against NATO members. These investments aim to reduce European dependence on American military protection. But military autonomy is only one dimension of strategic independence. Economic autonomy matters equally, perhaps more. Europe cannot credibly resist American coercion if American tariffs can crash European industries. It cannot credibly resist Chinese competition if Chinese exports can flood European markets. True strategic autonomy requires the capacity to defend economic interests against both powers simultaneously. This is where the China question becomes most acute. The anti-coercion instrument that France has requested against the United States was designed for use against China. The digital regulations that Trump's national security strategy demands Europe dismantle were designed to constrain American technology companies, but apply equally to Chinese competitors. The trade tools Europe possesses are double-edged swords that cut in both directions. The coming months will reveal whether European unity survives the pressure it now faces. The immediate test is the Greenland tariffs, set to take effect February 1st. If Europe responds with coordinated countermeasures, it will demonstrate capacity for collective action that many have doubted. If member states fragment, pursuing bilateral accommodations with Washington, the moment of potential realignment will pass without result. China is watching this test with intense interest. Beijing does not need Europe to abandon the transatlantic alliance. It needs Europe to demonstrate that alternatives exist. The mere possibility of European engagement with China provides leverage that European negotiators can deploy against American pressure. The threat need not be credible to be useful. It need only be visible. There is a deeper strategic logic at work that transcends the immediate crisis. The international order constructed after World War II was designed to embed American power in institutional frameworks that constrained both America and its potential rivals. NATO bound American military power to European defense. The Bretton Woods institutions bound American economic power to rules-based commerce. The United Nations bound American diplomatic power to multilateral decision-making. These constraints were accepted because they served American interests. They extended American influence while limiting American costs. Trump has decided that the constraints no longer serve American interests. He is systematically dismantling the institutional frameworks that embedded American power, apparently believing that unconstrained American power will serve American interests better. This is a testable hypothesis. The evidence accumulating from the Greenland crisis, from the Venezuela operation, from the tariff wars, suggests the hypothesis may be wrong. Unconstrained power generates resistance. Coercion breeds counter-coalitions. The attempt to dominate everyone simultaneously may produce an alignment of everyone against the dominant power. China understands this dynamic better than most. Chinese strategists have studied the history of hegemonic overreach. They know that empires fall not from external attack, but from internal contradiction, from the gap between commitments and capabilities, from the resistance generated by the exercise of power itself. They do not need to defeat America. They need America to defeat itself. The role China offers Europe in this drama is not that of ally, but of beneficiary. Europe can profit from American overreach without participating in its consequences. It can maintain relationships with both powers while committing fully to neither. It can preserve options that would disappear if it aligned exclusively with either Washington or Beijing. This is not a heroic posture, but it may be a survivable one. The phrase World War III carries apocalyptic connotations that obscure rather than illuminate the current moment. What we are witnessing is not the prelude to nuclear annihilation. It is the reordering of global power through economic competition, institutional collapse, and strategic realignment. The old order is dying. The new order is not yet born. And in the interregnum, as Gramsci observed, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. China's role in this transition is not to fight America, but to outlast it. Not to conquer Europe, but to court it. Not to win World War III, but to ensure that if such a war ever came, it would not have to fight it alone. The patient accumulation of economic relationships, diplomatic credit, and strategic options is Beijing's answer to American military supremacy. You cannot defeat the strongest power by matching its strength. You can only defeat it by making its strength irrelevant. Europe finds itself caught between these contending visions of world order. One vision, increasingly abandoned by its traditional champion, emphasizes rules, institutions, and collective security. The other vision, increasingly ascendant in Beijing and now apparently embraced in Washington, emphasizes power, interest, and bilateral bargaining. The choice Europe makes between these visions will shape the century to come. China will not help Europe against Trump in any conventional sense, but China will be there, offering alternatives, maintaining relationships, providing options, when Europe concludes that Trump cannot be managed and American alliance cannot be trusted. That presence, that availability, that patient readiness to engage is the form Chinese assistance takes. It is not the cavalry riding to the rescue. It is the negotiating partner waiting in the wings. The world war that matters is not fought with armies. It is fought with supply chains, reserve currencies, technology standards, and institutional frameworks. In that war, China has positioned itself to benefit, regardless of who wins the battles between America and Europe, and that positioning may ultimately prove more consequential than any military campaign.